Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening to you of those on the East Coast. My name is Jen Farnham. I'm with my partner here, Alex, and we're going to talk today a little bit about leveraging AI to overcome barriers with respect to language barrier translation in legal operations. So we're going to go over a few of the key points that we hear from our clients very often about what they're running into and the types of issues that they're having. And then Alex is going to talk a little bit about what we've done to help them solve that problem. And then we're going to follow that with a live demo that's actually going to show you the solution and really help you understand some ways that you can really mitigate the risk around your document storage program, your compliance program, and really reducing that risk when it comes to having documents either being stored in multiple languages or needing to be produced in multiple language, either for e-discovery purposes, litigation, or just general legal needs around maybe employee handbooks and things like that. So I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Jen Farnham. I'm the Legal Business Development Director for Park IP, which is now a relocalized company. And I will let Alex do a quick intro for himself before we get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Januszewski. I look after AI deployments at Relocalize, and I'm going to be talking about the technical piece, as Jen mentioned, anything related to AI deployments and showing you the demo as well.
All right, so just a quick overview of our company. We are Park IP, a Relocalized company. We won't spend too much time on these numbers, but we really just wanted to give you a feel of really how our footprint is pretty global. We have worldwide operations and employees in many areas. Many companies work with us across the globe. We have a very strong presence with various language pairs. The number of linguists that we use, they're the best in the industry when it comes to their certifications and the requirements it takes to work for us. And then as a company, we have all of the certifications that are going to be pertinent when it comes to your specific vertical or line of business. And then, our industry expertise is really second to none when it comes to the amount of, finance, IP, different types of companies that we work with, technology clients, manufacturing, and consumer. So I imagine that all of you on the call today probably fall into at least one of those buckets. And the point here is that we've done work with all different types of clients and all different markets. And so we definitely have the expertise that will be there to really be a partner for your team. This is just a quick overview of really what we do, and I think the point here is that we work with global organizations and law firms to really help harmonize their language and their assets across the board. So we want to make sure that you've got consistent quality, consistent levels of translation, the same type of output and confidence that you have in one language versus another and in one matter versus another, ensuring that you always have the same level of confidence when your team is going into court or if you're going through an audit. That's really important. And of course, what that does is really it increases your compliance across the board. So whether you're in risk or if you're on some type of legal team within the organization, you can be equally confident in both cases that your contracts are going to be accurate or your e-discovery and documentation for litigation is going to be accurate, because we really work with organizations across the board when it comes to their legal operational matters. Our core competency does lie in translations and localization. However, we do support various legal and compliance matters really with all of our clients. So whether it's intellectual property, litigation, e-discovery work, or just general legal work, procurement, things of that nature, we really do work with our clients across the board with anything that they might need help with, kind of overcoming some of those language barriers. When it comes to really managing the risk and discovery, the big piece of it is the exponential growth in information. So, as you guys are aware, since the majority of you are either in legal ops or in some type of risk or compliance role, corporate compliance really does cover both those internal and external policies, as well as state laws and regulations around what you need to be doing with that information and how you can either move it across borders or how it needs to be kept, things of that nature. Really where it comes into play is that organizations really need to start planning in advance for audits and investigations to ensure that they're reducing their overall risk. It's very difficult to be in a situation where you have a lawsuit or some type of litigation or some type of audit and you have no idea where anything is or how to find it or how to figure out what the content is. So really understanding what information is relevant in those situations is typically the biggest hurdle to overcome. And now when we're dealing with, workers being in remote offices, you've got dispersed collaborations, things may have been, emailed around much more often than they used to be in the past. Now you're trying to determine, do I have copies out here that could potentially be discoverable? That's really important. So understanding where that information exists and what that content includes is really the crux of ensuring that you have a good compliance program, because any of that information can be requested, and if you don't realize that there's a copy out there somewhere, that is certainly going to be discoverable content. And we all know that electronic content is far more easy to find in the case of an audit or some type of litigation. So it's really important to get a hold of where the information is and what the information consists of. And as I said, unfortunately, all this information can be requested in the case of a lawsuit or audit as part of the process. So really ensuring that you have a good program in place and that your employees are well trained around what they should be doing with that information is super important. And of course, there's going to be massive increases in data leakage with remote operations, with email, with people potentially printing at home, and all of those things can really lead to a much more difficult compliance program. And of course, when that information is in multiple languages, it becomes considerably more difficult to deal with. So really, when we're looking at the main areas of risk when language barriers are present, as we discussed, teams working remotely, I think is a new one that we're all kind of dealing with, and it seems to be getting a longer and longer time period that's going to be existing. But we used to work in the office together, and maybe have a shred all policy or things like that, where we knew that there was a far better control over where these documents were being stored. Employees were on networks; they weren't needing to use VPNs and things like that. So there's a lot more control over the sharing and the creation of information that we don't necessarily have these days. The need for documents in multiple locations, again, that's dispersed, sharing of these documents, redundancy in copies, creating a much larger digital footprint of all of these documents. That's a real big issue that needs to be addressed, I think, more closely than it has in the past, just because of the pandemic and really everybody's sort of on their own with their own offices, and certainly we're not being as strict and compliant as we should be. I mean, I know I've not been focusing on that as much as I would have if I was sitting in an office and being reminded constantly of it with shred bins and things like that. So policy updates really need to incorporate the rules and regulations for this new world we live in, these new business operations that need to be created around remote workspaces primarily, and ensuring that your employees all over the world are able to read what those rules and guidelines are. So we typically see a lot of the information being generated in English, whether it's policies, handbooks, HR documents, things like that. But it's really important that that information is translated accurately and correctly, and then shared with your employees across the globe to make sure that you have a consistent compliance program for your entire organization. We, of course, are seeing increased regulations, and I think those are going to continue to increase, given how long this pandemic is going, and not really understanding how much longer it's going to be, where we're living in this world of remote workspaces. The possible breaches from information, emailing documents across borders, a lot of times that's a big no-no, and your employees may not be aware of that. With things like Safe Harbor and GDPR and CCPA, all that privacy information that's out there, if that's being emailed across borders, that's a breach, and we need to make sure that your team is aware of that, that your employees in the US are aware of that, but also that your employees across the globe are aware of that, and try to get some control so you're not exposing yourself to potential lawsuits. Vital information is very often lost in translation, and that's really where we see the potential for risk increase, because you may have great policies in the US, but again, everybody in the US, I mean, we have a very large language population here, and that's maybe 10 or 15 languages just here in California that most things do need to be translated into, even for the US workers. So you can imagine how much that can exponentially increase across the globe. What we're finding is that a lot of employees are using online tools, such as Google Translate. And this can lead to serious policy breaches, especially if it's confidential information that's being posted into there. You've all probably used Google Translate at some point, but the real issue is if you don't understand what is in that email or what's in that contract, and you post that into Google, we all know that, you know, when we Google something, it tends to appear in our Facebook, it tends to appear in our Twitter. It definitely is being tracked and monitored. So, you know, for example, if you get an HR email and it's somebody's, you know, private health information, but you can't read it because it's in a different language and you put that into Google, how does that impact your organization? How does it impact that employee who now has had their private health information translated on, you know, an online tool? So those are the types of things that we're seeing and you know, making our clients aware of, because in the past, you know, it wasn't really something that our risk teams and the compliance teams were really focused on. But now with the remote workspaces and all that, it really is becoming something that needs to be addressed. And then, of course, using tools like that are going to lead to inconsistent translation quality. You're not going to have any control over, you know, what the output is. And sometimes you see employees purchasing language systems, and so you might be paying for multiple different programs that are, again, aren't giving you that consistent output. Certainly not something you'd want to use in the case of a, you know, litigation or some type of lawsuit, because you have no idea if the content is correct. So it's really important as you're dealing with these language barriers, and you know, if you're in some type of situation where you're constantly running into internal communications or email documentation or intellectual property, patents, all of those type of things that, you know, are very commonly needed in multiple languages, it's very important to work with a language service provider that can help you get control over that, get you into some type of program where we're seeing our best practices and help you figure out what that is for your organization. And then, of course, provide the tool for you to be able to do that on-the-fly translation without having to use something that's not compliant, like Google Translate or any of the other online tools your employees might be using. So this is just a quick little blurb, and you know, I've been guilty of using Google Translate too, and probably like many of you, I just click the button that says I accept because I want to be able to translate the, you know, the little sentence or the paragraph that I'm looking at. But if you actually look at the content of what you're signing up to, this little highlighted area here really shows how it can be super important and super detrimental to your organization if you're posting confidential information of any kind. If there's patent information, if there's HR information, anything that could potentially be linked to a lawsuit or litigation or an audit or, you know, some type of workers' comp situation, this basically tells you that that information is now available for their use, and they can kind of use it however they want. So it's very important that you understand that anything you put into an online tool is going to have this type of implication. So what we really wanted to talk with you today about is using some really intelligent machine translation, AI, other, you know, really pertinent things that we're hearing a lot about from our clients, and we really feel is going to be valuable to your organization in helping you deal with this very important piece of the puzzle when it comes to language barriers. So Alex is going to kind of jump in now, since this is his area of expertise, and he's going to go over some of the specifics around what I've been talking about with respect to the solution that we have, and then he's going to go into a live demo for us. So Alex, feel free to jump in.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to first level set and kind of explain a little bit about AI and machine learning. I'm sure you heard these terms quite a bit. I'll explain how we define them and hopefully give you kind of a metaphor that may help how to think about it, right? So essentially, if you look at the bigger circle, the biggest circle here, artificial intelligence essentially is involving machines that perform tasks that are characteristic of human intelligence. And we'll speak about that in a moment. Now, machine learning, which is the orange circle, which sits within AI, it's basically a set of algorithms that allow the machine to learn without explicitly being programmed. So by that, what we mean is we're not giving rules to the machine that say, if this, then that. Right? What we're doing is we're giving examples to the machine, and the machine, much like a human being, learns to generalize those examples. Right? So that's the idea of learning without being explicitly programmed. Within machine learning, you may have heard this idea of deep learning or neural networks. The idea of this is that these are algorithms. They're part of machine learning, but they're modeled loosely after the human brain. This is actually the methodology that's used to train machine translation engines. So as a very, very loose example of what that is, if you look at the bottom of the screen, if I were to ask you, what is that? I'm sure within a split second, all of you, the vast majority of you would say, well, this is a dog leash, right? And if I asked you to stop and kind of unpack how you got to that point, right? Even though it took you maybe a split second to say that it was a dog leash, right? You would probably say, well, it looks like something that would be used to walk an animal, right? Now, if you're thinking about animals, you're typically not gonna, it would have to be an animal that can walk on the ground, right? You're not gonna walk a fish, you're not gonna walk a bird, right? So that kind of limits what we do. Also, you're typically not gonna be walking a cow, you're not gonna be walking a crocodile, so that further diminishes what we do, right? And then if we kind of start talking about domesticated animals, right, you're probably not gonna walk a cat. A cat's not gonna be very happy about that. You could conceivably walk a ferret, but that's highly unlikely. So more likely it's gonna be a dog, right? So that's how we got to the idea that this is a dog leash. Now, the reason I explained all of that is that in essence, that's how these deep learning neural networks work, right? They look for context, and context is represented by a bunch of features, essentially the way I just described to you, right? That in this context, it's more likely to be X than Y with this degree of probability, and that's how we get to our answer, right? And in the case of machine translation, that's essentially how we get to our translation from one language into another. So next, yeah. So a little bit under the hood of what we're going to see, right? So this is AI under the hood after we kind of had an explanation of what AI is. So what you're going to see is we can use either generic or customizable neural machine translation. And where we differentiate ourselves is that we can choose the best of breed by locale pair. In other words, if we know that a particular machine translation engine is better for this provider for French to English, we're going to use that. For Spanish to English, it may be a completely different one, right? And we could further customize them to improve translation quality. You'll see that on the next slide. Another thing that we do is language identification. So if you don't know what the language is, we'll be able to detect it for you. We also run some proprietary pre and post-processing routines to improve the machine translation quality. One of the things that we're working on, this is very topical, is the idea of removing bias, right? So a lot of these engines, when they're trained by Google, by Microsoft, by Amazon, for example, they have an inherent bias in them, right? And that's because of the data that they have, right? And that bias may be, well, if I'm referring to a doctor, that's a male. If I'm referring to a nurse, that's a female. We know obviously that's not true, right? So one of the things that we're looking into doing is actually picking up additional information by context, right? So we can properly assign the pronoun. Just some technical information. The portal that I'm going to show you, it supports a wide variety of operating systems, Windows, Mac, Linux. As far as browser support, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, Opera, kind of the most popular ones. It's hosted in a secure cloud environment by Relocalize, or could be on-premise. And lastly, and most importantly, is that your client data is confidential. It's not tracked by us. It's not retained by us. The moment we translate, that data is not retained by us. And if we go to the next slide, please. Right, so a little bit on training the machine translation engine. What does that mean, right? So if I give you an innocuous word like driver and say the driver is not working, what does that refer to, right? It could be a golf club, right? That could be a driver. It could be a motor vehicle operator if we're dealing with Lyft or Uber. For that matter, if we're dealing with Dell or HP or Canon, it could be a device driver or a printer driver, right? So only if you have context can you tell, right? You could see some additional sentences. Our competitors had similar issues. Their help desk received many similar complaints. That would point to the fact that we're not dealing with a sports equipment company, nor Uber or Lyft, but more likely a device driver, right? So we could go ahead and train our engine. We could customize it to give more relevant output. Right. As another example of this, we had a case a couple of years ago where we were translating the last name Gatti, G-A-T-T-I, from Italian into English, right? And we told the customer, we really strongly suggest that you customize the engine. And they said, no, go ahead and use the generic engine. Then they came back to us and said, well, why does it say Miss Cat said so-and-so? Well, because Gatti is actually also the Italian word for cat in addition to last name, right? Once we fixed that and customized the engine, that actually went away. So now let me go ahead and start sharing my screen, and I'm going to show you a little bit of how the MT portal works. Great. So hopefully you can see my screen. Right. So here we are. We're logged into the MT portal, and the first thing that you see is a dashboard, right? And the dashboard basically works on a subscription model. You buy a certain number of words. You can see when the subscription was created, and you can see how many words you have remaining, both overall and percentage-wise. This shows you This shows you how many words you've used and how many words remain. The OK icon tells you that your subscription's up to date. You have lots of words that remain. This would turn to yellow if you're beginning to get to very less than 20% of words remaining, and then we would reach out to you to top up the subscription. So some other useful information, this shows you traffic, so the number of words translated within the last 30 days. You can see peaks and valleys. Right? On this particular day, I translated almost 1 million words. Then I had a little bit of a lull. You can also set this to a custom period. So if I wanted to, for example, I could go ahead and go to the beginning of May, just by clicking May 1. I could also go to the beginning of the quarter, or for that matter, I could go to the beginning of the year. So that's kind of a nice, handy way to give you an idea of what your usage is. Another very useful tool is for you to see the source language and the target language. Again, this starts out for the last 30 days, but this can go to a custom period. So this shows you the source language, the language that you started in, the language that you translated into, how many words you translated, the percentage of overall words, and the last activity. Now, clients find that this is a very nice sanity check, because let's say I'm doing a case where I need to go from German into English. You could see how many words that represent, and last time I translated. And let's say, for example, I don't do a lot of work from, let's say, English to Dutch. That will be at the bottom of my list, right? So that's a nice way to sanity check that, in fact, what I expect to happen is happening. So primarily you'd be interacting here with translate text and translate documents. So let's take a look at translate text first. Hopefully you'll see that the UI is very, very straightforward. And one thing you can do here is, if you don't know the language, you can use auto detect, much like you would in a Microsoft or a Google. Right? So I'm just going to put in a phrase, and I'm going to press translate. It's going to take a couple of seconds to identify the language. And here we've identified it and translated it into Afrikaans. Right here, you can see that there are over 70 languages that we translate into, including kind of your usual suspects like French, German, Italian, etc. Now, what happened here very quickly behind the scenes is, unlike a Google or unlike a Microsoft, we actually looked at several different algorithms to improve the probability that we're finding the correct language. And once we did, we translated it to the target language. So let me show you, I spoke a little bit about these neat bells and whistles that have to do with pre and post processing. So let's take a look at Microsoft again. Keep in mind that Microsoft is not confidential, as we showed you. So here I'm doing a translation of these 4 different sentences. And a couple of things to point out. I purposely misspelled the word weather, and you could see that Microsoft didn't know what to do with it. It said, well, this is not a real word. I'm just going to pass that along, right? Here, this is a correct translation. However, in French, it's obligatory to have a space before the exclamation mark. So from the standpoint of style, from orthography, this is actually incorrect, though the translation is correct. This one is actually ironic. Here's Microsoft, and here's a simple path, C Windows temp, and you could see that the backslashes were erased, right? Which is a bit ironic because it's Microsoft translating their own content, if you will. Here we see the opposite mistake, right? We have the word hello between 2 placeholders, and we have an extra space that's inserted here. So let's actually do the same thing in our tool. So I'm going to go ahead and choose English, and I'm going to go into French. And I'm going to paste these sentences, press translate, and notice what happens. So first of all, we translated the word weather. Here it is. And the way we did that is we realized that this is a common misspelling, so we corrected it before the translation. Here, we realized, wait a second, we're translating from English into French, therefore this space is obligatory, and we put it in. Here, we realized that this is a path, so we have to leave it as is, and nothing should be translated. And lastly, these placeholders, even though Microsoft had this extra space here, we realized that these are placeholders and they don't require a path, right? And so we removed the extra space, right? So this is translate text. The way this works, again, is you just basically copy and paste from anything into this panel and you get your translation. If you like, you could also give translation feedback. So you could say, okay, I translated, let's say, from English into French, and here was my translation. Here's my suggested translation, and something like, please fix this if you wanted to give us comments, and we would receive that. Let's take a look at translate documents. This also has some very nice features. So again, same number of 70 language combinations that we have, but I want to draw your attention to the file types. We support old Office, current Office, TXT, HTML, and here's some really, really nice ones. We support PDFs, so we'll read your PDF, we'll OCR it, we'll actually translate it, and we also support images. So we'll be able to extract the text from an image and actually translate it. So let's give this a shot. I'm going to go from English into Spanish. Right, we already did French, so let's do Spanish. And what I can do is I can select the files, or I can just drag them in here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag them in here. Let me just move this over a little bit. Right, so here are my files. Here's a Word file, and here is a JPEG. And just to show you what it looks like, right, we're going to be seeing if we can go ahead and extract this text from the image, right? And here, what we're interested in doing, these are a couple of blurbs about WeLocalize. Notice that I have 2 bullets. So we want to see whether we can preserve the formatting, preserve these bullets, and whether we'll have a bold and underline. So let's go ahead and take these files. We'll drag them in here. You'll see that it says 2 files selected. I'm going to press translate. And just as a sanity check, the system is going to tell me, here is your unique project ID, right? This is only associated with me, right? Each user has their own. So I can't go into yours, you can't go into mine. Again, as a sanity check, English is your source language. We're going into Spanish, and here are the files, right? And you press OK. Now, what's going to happen is when this translation is done, and this happens, again, depending on how large the file is. If it's a large file, it can take a little bit of time. This is a small file, so we should get our translation fairly quickly. I can go off and do my other work, and when I'm done, I'll actually get an email message telling me, please go in and collect your work. So let's actually check if we got that already. And actually, that was very, very quick, right? So here's our email that says, here is your unique download link. Again, here's your unique project ID. Everything went well. We processed 2 files for you. Nothing failed. Here we give you an additional blurb that says, look, if you have information that you think is salient to your work and really should be edited by a human being, please reach out to us and we can quote you on, we can give you a quote on doing human translation work. Now, again, notice this point that I was making about deletion. The moment you collect this file, or in 24 hours, either one or the other, the moment I collect this file, that's it. You can no longer, it's permanently deleted from our system, right? Also, if you don't collect it after 24 hours, we delete it, so we don't retain it on our system. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. It's going to bring me back into the server. Again, here's my unique ID. I press download. It's going to download my files as a zip file, and I can indicate where I would like them to go. And so here they are. So let's say I'm going to put them on in the same folder that I was working on, right over here. And here are my files. So let me unzip them. And let's take a look first. You'll notice that ES tells us that it's the suffix that we added to say we're going into Spanish, right? So you'll see here, here is our file of that image that says what's the definition of success. We actually were able to grab the text and from the image and actually translate it. And here's our other file, the Word file that has ES again to tell us that it went into Spanish. And notice that just as in English, we have 2 bullets. We have the first mention of WeLocalize in bold, and then we have the second mention of WeLocalize in underline. So let me stop here and go ahead and have Jen share.
Perfect. So hopefully that was helpful to you. I always find that it's a great solution because we do have a lot of clients raising this question around, how do we become more compliant, but still be able to get our translations done quick enough for us to take action without having to wait, for maybe a human translation quote to come back and then to wait for that to be done. So how we're seeing our clients typically use this is really to kind of figure out what the overall arching content is of a document or an email. And then if it's something that they feel is pertinent to their business, then they can always request human translation afterwards if they want to ensure that it's certified and fully QA'd and ready for some type of litigation or for use in some type of formal legal matter. So we really do see a lot of potential for this to help your organization. And we just wanted to give you our contact information here to let you know that if you have any additional questions, you can reach out to either one of us. We also have a couple of websites here on the side and a legal services email that you can always email directly if you'd like to request either a private demo or get a little bit more understanding about how the system works. If there's IT interest in understanding that, we can certainly address that with you if requested. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat here or the question box on the side. We'll address those, but looks like we've gotten a few questions already, Alex. So if you don't mind, I will just read them to you and perhaps you can just kind of talk to them a bit.
Sure, that would be great.
Okay, perfect. So the first one that we've got, the client was asking if you could talk about confidentiality with respect to machine translation.
Right, so we were showing you the verbiage from Microsoft and Google. They all have the same verbiage. So in our case, we're an ISO certified company and confidentiality happens through a couple of different, confidentiality and security happens through a couple of different means. Our means of communication is HTTPS. So that's secure. When we send our request to machine translation, it's also by HTTPS. And we actually have, with the providers, we have a no-track policy. So they don't retain our data. Our data is, the data that we send is completely confidential, right? If we do use third-party engines, it's deleted by them immediately and deleted by us after the translation, as I was showing you.
Perfect. Second question, they were asking if you could talk a little bit more about language identification and how that works with our system.
Yeah, so that's actually because I'm a bit of a linguistic nerd. That's my background. This is actually something that we're very proud of. So basically, what we're doing is called language identification with majority polling. So unlike one algorithm that Microsoft or Google have, we actually have 5 algorithms. So what we're doing is we're going in turn to 5 different language identification algorithms and saying, what language is this? Right? And letting them vote and then taking the majority vote. Now, the reason we're doing that is because a lot of time languages are similar, especially for very short sentences. Danish and Norwegian are similar, Russian and Ukrainian, Spanish and Catalan. So what by doing that, if let's say we're going to 5 different language ID algorithms and 3 of them say this is Spanish, we have a high degree of confidence that in fact it is Spanish. Right, so that's the idea, kind of the more the merrier because it improves our probability.
Right, and the last question that we received was you had mentioned kind of in passing best in breed. Can you explain a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, so different providers are have a specialty for some languages and some domains, right? That's not something that they advertise, of course. In our case, because we have a department dedicated specifically to AI, and we have over 30 machine translation enterprise programs that we're running for Fortune 500 companies, we're constantly benchmarking what the best locale combinations are for each provider, right? So what that allows us to do is to say, okay, we're an early access partner, for example, with Google. We have confidentiality and security with them because we use an API, and we know that they're good for Spanish to English. That's what we're going to use. But we know that Italian to English might be better for someone else. So we've built our system in such a way that we have an MT broker or connector on the back end that allows us to disseminate the request to whatever the best engine is. And if we customize it, then it becomes even better.
Makes perfect sense. So it looks like I don't see any other questions coming in. So just to let you know, this there will be a recording for this. It will be shared, so you'll have access to this. Being registered for the event, you will be able to review this again. All the information in this presentation will be provided to you. And as I mentioned, if you have any follow-up questions, or if you take another look at this and have any additional points of clarification, please don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us. We will be there to answer any of the questions. And again, if you'd like to have an additional demo, or perhaps bring on some of your team members to have another demo and just to get them involved, we'd be happy to do that as well. So I think that's everything we have for today, unless there are any other questions that I see pop through, and I do not. I think that we are okay to conclude this webinar today. Leah, thank you again very much for attending. We hope it was relevant and pertinent to your business. And please let us know if you have any additional questions. Thank you.